again, is going to be about raising capital and the path to raising money efficiently and the correct way. We'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today. And with that, let's just jump in and do real quick. We'll each take one question about what is the current state of venture capital, things you're seeing, kind of emerging trends, what's going on out there.
First, I have a question. Who in this room is actually raising money right now? All right, it's helpful. Who's raised money before? All right, this will be great. Cool.
So who? Hello. Yes. Who wants to raise money, or like maybe will be raising money in the next, like, let's say 2 years? So that's like pretty much the whole room. Everybody here wants money.
Does anybody like raising money?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so no one likes raising money. It's a necessary evil with a lot of startup financing. We'll get into kind of the what it's for, right? The good and the bad. Should you be raising capital to step on the gas? Should you be raising capital to hire a team? Or should you not be raising capital at all, which is an interesting topic for an investor panel. So with that.
So I guess my 2 cents on the whole thing is I actually think it's an amazing climate for raising money because it's harder than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worse than it was in 15. I actually believe it's a good thing.
That's some good insight as well. Cheryl?
I guess I would echo it. I would also say that at least day to day, if you're in a vertical where you're changing something, like you're taking like a paper to digital problem or whatnot, stop worrying about the funding climate. You're probably saving a business or people real money out there. Just go out and raise money and stop worrying about it. You know, we'll always mention it in the VC side because it helps us to tell you it's harder. We hope you'll be more communicative. We hope that you will, give us more time, give us more reference calls, help us do our part, right? It behooves us to tell you it's hard to raise money, but just close your eyes and go do it. And I would, not introspect too much about the circumstance. There's still plenty of money out there.
I think one of the biggest things that I'm seeing right now, especially when I'm outside of Silicon Valley, is that people are realizing that raising money and getting money from venture capitalists don't have to be one and the same. So everything from crowdfunding, which like works for some people, but honestly, like if you know a really wealthy lawyer, doctor, real estate developer, you family office, the people who've given me money even for my company, none of them come from traditional venture capital. And that's actually, there are pluses and minuses, but especially in early stage, especially seed funding, if all you need is capital to go out and start proving things, get it from wherever you can get it. A lot of times, and I count myself among these, unfortunately, as a reformed VC, investors are a pain in the ass and they waste so much of your time that if you can just go out and get money from somebody else and hit the ground running, you're going to be better off.
So that's actually a nice segue to the next point, which is since VCs and a lot of investors can be kind of a big pain in the ass, what is the ideal relationship that you look for as an investor? Like, what is the relationship you want to see from a company as you're making an investment, and how do you manage that?
Well, as someone who has a lot of relationships like that, the one thing I've learned is that it's, having a real relationship is really important. We sometimes talk about the fact that like when you go and pitch, you get advice, and when you ask for advice, you get money. And oftentimes the easiest rounds to get done are the ones where you weren't actually out running a process because you have a relationship with someone. And so if you're an entrepreneur, you cannot treat fundraising like this painful thing you have to do twice a year or once a year. If in the background of running your business, you're building relationships with investors, getting feedback, having beers with people, going for hikes, like building personal relationships, when the moment comes that it's time for you to bring more capital into the business, you'll be amazed at what happens.
I would say, though, also keep in mind that it's a lot easier to do the kinds of things you're talking about when you show up and you're like, hey, I'm a white dude and I went to Stanford like you, and we both are wearing, plaid button-down shirts, because all VCs love plaid button-down shirts. And I don't know why they do, but they really do. So, keep that in mind too, right? Like if that's your trajectory, great. If you have that network already, or, obviously you're all sitting in a conference room in San Jose, so, you know the way to Silicon Valley, build that network. That being said, there aren't a lot of guys who are like VCs who try to like take me out for a hike and have it just be a hike, and I mean that it is what it is, right? So keep in mind that if it's not realistic for you to be able to just become kind of organic BFF with a bunch of white and Asian dudes who are approximately 27 to 55, you can impress them just with raw numbers, profit margins. Like, really good businesses get me way more excited than my buddy wanting to do some stupid, like, I don't even know, Airbnb for like dog vacations, right? No offense to dog vacay.
I think I'll come in here on the middle between you two on where we stand on this. First of all, on relationships, engage the VCs, especially, this is really important for later rounds, like 12 to 6 months before you're actually raising. You hopefully already, if you've got some investors, you're sending out like a quarterly update on how your company's doing. If you met a VC or an investor and you like them, put them on the email to share a little of your company data. It's okay. Give us a sense of how you've been running. Because if we've known you and we've seen you operate and be capable for 1 year, we are way more likely to start writing you $1 million checks. And that's something that you can do just by being organized and having people's emails. And when you're more organized, you prepare like a good data room, your pitch decks are great, you give us a bunch of materials, you allow us, if you're not a fit for us, to actually send you a lead to another VC. We spend a lot of time with other VCs. VCs know plenty of other VCs. If you're a great lead but you're not a fit for us, you're probably going to get sent to somebody else.
I would also say 2 things that I've noticed a lot. Share your press. So like tweet out your press, put it on like your personal Facebook pages and stuff, because investors see that, and all of a sudden seeing some outside third-party confirmation might spark some interest or something. And then the other thing is, when you run into an investor, I got a phone call the other day from a guy I know down in LA who's an investor, calling me out of the blue. He starts asking, I ask him a question, he asks me about my company, I immediately just drop into, here's our metrics, here's what we're doing, here's our road path. And so, I mean, you could wake me up out of a dead slumber, and like, I'd be like, oh, okay, Cheryl, here's what you need to know about my company. And so being ready to do that and have these impressive top line metrics can make a huge difference if you're not necessarily building best friendships with VCs, because you bump into somebody for 2 seconds, you tell them something interesting about their company, about your company, and they're like, I should follow up on that. Or to her point, they run into somebody else and they say, you need to talk to these guys because they have 90% profit margins, they're growing at 200% a year, and that's literally the only thing I heard from them.
So that's a good point. So bringing up that communication and getting the metrics out there, starting to identify with investors who you might be interested in, establishing a relationship. So some of the folks in here who have not raised capital, how do you get to the ask, right? You've been communicating, things are going well, you've gone on some hikes, you've turned down some hikes. So what's the next step? How do you to get them to actually be interested in making an investment?
Want to go for a hike, John?
I hate hiking.
Screw hiking. No one's going hiking. I think the point that I was making that I think Sarah maybe missed a little was when you write, as an investor, when you write a check, it's not wow, company has great metrics, you qualify, here's a check, thank you very much. In many cases, you're involved with a company for 10 years. Mm-hmm. Great businesses take a really long time to develop. And so my point was, make sure that there's a relationship to be had more than the money. But to answer your question, venture is actually a really crappy place to go find capital, right? I think the industry is put on a pedestal it doesn't deserve. It is not a great place to find capital. The expectations for the returns are really high. The reason that VCs sometimes have to behave the way they do is because we're in business too, right? Mm-hmm. And there's lots of other pools of capital out there, to Sarah's point, depending on the stage of the company. So, if I was giving advice to my former entrepreneur self, like the VC market is the last place you go when it's clear you're really ready for it and you know exactly what you're getting into.
And don't forget, we're in it to make money. Sometimes it's sort of hard because you want to be successful, and unfortunately our job is fundamentally to turn $1 into $2, and then sometimes entrepreneurs don't feel like we're supporting them when we start to think that way, but that's literally our job, and we have an actual duty to the people that gave us money to manage to do that well. So another thing you can do is when you meet an investor, ask them questions about where they are. One thing that a lot of first-time entrepreneurs don't think to ask a VC is, are you currently raising a fund? Because if you are, they're probably not that engaged actually in doing deals right now. And especially right now, a lot of the mid-sized VCs that have like a fund size between like 12 million and 100 million, it's taking them longer to close their rounds. They've been on the road for 9 months already, and maybe they're at like 25 million of that 75, and they're completely focused on closing it so they can get back to work. And so if you find out they're busy, then you can more easily say, well, is there someone else you think I should talk to? So it seems exhausting that, it's so hard to get to VCs in the first place, and now I'm telling you, well, go and figure out if they're really the right one for you and see where they are very specifically. But typically when you demonstrate that and have a conversation with them, they'll be more impressed with you, and they're more likely to send you along to someone else if they're not ready to give you capital.
If you're really interested in VC funding specifically, I would highly recommend, I'll throw Techstars a bone here, I'd highly recommend going and buying Brad Feld's book, it's like How to Outsmart Your Venture Capitalist or Be Smarter
Venture
Than...
deals.
Yeah, venture. And it's great because it explains the venture math to you, which is a fund lasts 10 years, and you only invest for the first 5 to 7 of it. Then you need to bring your capital back. You need to raise a new fund. And just to understand that these are people who, they're typically wealthy people who have very nice Teslas and kids in private school, and they need to maintain that, right? So how do you actually help them do their job, which is not to actually help you? That's a byproduct. It's to return the money to the people who've given them money. And so if you really want VC money, you don't have a company that's just completely exploding like the next Facebook, go read that book and also spend time on things like Crunchbase and AngelList to understand where they're at, like she was saying, in their fundraising cycles. When's the last time they raised a fund? How many GPs do they have? What are their areas of interest? Stalk your VCs. Look at them up on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere you can, to just get a sense of things they care about. And if they have a son who plays youth basketball, are they going to be more interested in your kid's sports startup? Probably, right? If they have a family member who died of some rare disease, are they going to be more interested in your bioscience startup? Probably, right? So figure out who the best person to talk to is, and then do kind of the other things we're saying in terms of networking and getting out there and getting in front of them. Twitter is the best place to network. There's no weirdness, and you can just tweet at people and they can tweet back at you, and Mark Andreessen will randomly retweet me, and then I get so many followers. And it's just a great way to kind of establish yourself, quote unquote, as somebody in the space. Make sure your Twitter bio is easy to understand, link to your company. Don't say dog mom to, no, say that you're the CEO of XYZ, right? And just make it really easy to connect with you online, because a lot of times that's what the investors are going to do if they do hear about you. Not through a super warm intro. They're going to do a quick Google search, and they want to find things that reinforce their idea that maybe you're building something they want to be involved in.
And this stuff will all make you better salesmen too, especially if you're in a B2B startup. I need to actually see that you can sell, and most of these activities are exactly the same as if you're trying to do enterprise sales. So you're learning something that doesn't just apply to fundraising, I hope.
Right. Yeah, we've always been, said that you're selling a box that takes in $1 and gives $10 out, and that's your company, right? So if you can sell that to a VC, then you got your sales cycle down. So that said, when you're getting into these sales cycles and starting to pitch these VCs, are there any kind of criteria that jump out at each of you kind of personally when you look at investments?
What I found is actually that every investment opportunity is different. There's always, and I think it's true for startups as a whole. They're we're all here. There's been, billions of dollars spent in tech. There is no formula. There's always some magic combination of things that work. And the 3 things that we look at as categories are the people, the market, and what they've done, the story, the traction, right? So even if you're pre-revenue, what have you done in the period of time with the resources that you've had? Companies that move quickly, that solve problems, that iterate, founders that are passionate and have domain expertise or in it for the right reasons. But it's people, it's market, and then it's the pattern recognition around the execution.
And I would also add, it's sort of the technology timeline. I'm often, and this is my background as a technologist speaking, I think, but I'm trying to figure out why was the market and the tech not ready 3 years ago, and why is it ready today? And usually the entrepreneurs that have nailed that really immediately compel me. So right now, IoT is definitely there in every vertical that's ever existed in this world, and that's really exciting, because every day I feel like I get another deck that's telling me, oh, this thing is 30% inefficient, right? Logistics is just 30% inefficient. Biggest market in the world, and now for the first time, we can measure it, right? And we can make that all better, and that's just trillions and trillions of dollars. And you'll always catch us if there's a great value proposition like that wasn't possible 5 years ago. You can say it, clearly.
They have to use machine learning.
They have to.
Yeah.
I think it matters a lot who you are, and it's not necessarily like what school you went to or anything like that, but like who you are as a person. I've seen, especially in this like past few years, and you guys probably see this a lot too, there's some really smart ideas for companies and funds in some cases, and the people running them are basically like, their soul must just be like this black charred hole, because like the shit that they end up doing to their companies is just like full on like embezzlement and like stealing and shutting the company, like firing, sexual harassment, just crazy shit. And you're like, wow, everything about this company works so well. And in some cases, luckily, the companies and funds have been able to put in new management and they actually might survive. But you're like, everything was so right on, but we forgot to notice that you sold your soul to the devil. And so like, be a good person and make sure that the people that you're bringing on as co-founders and early employees and investors are good people. Do back channel and like find that out, because bad people with a great company are still going to run into problems because they're bad people. So that's a big thing I've seen over the past couple of years, some like really egregious examples. And then the other thing I think is in kind of like what you were saying with the value, have something in the deck, have some piece of information that even if the VC could care less about what you're doing, is like kind of a shocking, super fascinating, interesting stat. And it explains sort of where you're going to unlock value in that company. So maybe it's that all logistics have a 30% inefficiency. Maybe it's something like, I used to work in the fragrance world, right? 50% of men's fragrances are purchased by women, 50, right? So that's an interesting factoid about a market that you might not give a shit about. So just come in with something that just demonstrably an investor can wrap their head around as, this is the fact that's going to allow a team to succeed in this space. And then the second piece of that is kind of why you're the team or you're the person who's going to succeed in that space.
Excellent. So the next kind of point I wanted to drive home to is, because you are working so closely with investors, and I think this is true from some of the larger angels all the way through, institutional financing. You have such a close relationship and they have such weight in your company. Is regionality and like a physical proximity important, especially in this day and age with new methods of financing online and being able to be remote from your investors?
It all depends on the investor and the fund. There's no answer, but understanding that before you spend time with them is really helpful.
Maybe a clarifier too, like from the company's perspective, maybe more on the advice side of what should a company be wary of in investors that aren't local, that they cannot physically communicate with.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. The benefit to the company of having proximity to their investors is more face time, more opportunities for serendipitous interaction, and the investors' network is more local to you. But some investors have figured out how to invest, at scale or in a bunch of remote markets, or have offices in multiple locations and have solved that. So, it really depends.
I'd echo that, and also I'm a Washington, D.C. based venture capitalist, so this is a very painful point for me. We invest all across the U.S., and one of the big things that comes up is you find other firms you love working with, and you co-invest with them a lot, and that can really help, especially when things get rocky. I mean, that being said, especially if you're in a tough place, right, it is easier if your investors are nearby, so you can have tough conversations and kind of turn it productive rather than negative, rather than the whole, well, they flew in for the board meeting and now you have bad news for them, which is something you should completely avoid if you can. This regional thing reminds me of something earlier I wanted to say, which is some of the coolest, easiest money is actually government or city money related to innovation. So like in DC, we have a program, then they always seem to have extra money, they can't seem to give it out. And Virginia has CIT GAP, and I don't know the California programs, but most of them are easy, and I see them on cap tables everywhere. So please check out whatever city and state you're in. There may actually be an innovation fund available, and it's pretty easy money because they're investing for a purpose. They're not investing for return. So they're just happy because you're out there, forming new companies and creating economic activity. Same with economic stimulation departments. What are they called? AED. That's my favorite one. They're from Arlington, Virginia.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, especially if you're in a country or a region or a city that isn't normally the hub of innovation. So my guess is Silicon Valley probably has less of those, but like maybe South San Francisco has them because it's nothing but like parking lots and car dealerships, So always worth looking. I forgot your question.
So the
I need to answer it.
the importance of regionality and
Oh.
picking investors.
I think the important thing is that you can get in touch with your investors. So, like, be connected with them everywhere. I text my investors. One of my investors wanted to do an update call. She's an angel investor. Then she's like, actually, can I stay on your couch next week? I was like, sure, we can talk a lot. So, you know, just be willing to. One of my investors does a ton of stuff in media. So I was like on her radio show once, and that's where we caught up, was the walk from her radio show to the subway after. So just if investors are usually only helpful at inflection points, like if you need something from your investor every day on a sustained basis, they're probably either like wanting to work for you or telling you to like go get your shit together. So I would say that in general, like, know what you can ask for your investors, and it depends. The LA Dodgers are investors in my company through a venture fund from the hedge fund that owns the LA Dodgers, right? So I can reach out to them with like really randomly specific ask. Like I want bobbleheads in the Dodger Stadium, randomly specific ask. They didn't get back to me. But I also know that I have other investors where I can go down and sit with Ariel Zuckerberg a few miles up the road at her offices, and we'll whiteboard how to remove a layer of navigation from my app, right? Because she's an investor. So just be specific with your investor ask. I think once it's later stage, it might be more helpful to be a little bit closer, but if somebody gives you $100 million, like, they're going to know where you are and they're going to go look for you.
They will find you.
Yeah.
The one thing I would just add is the best thing you can do to positively manage an investor relationship is for there to be no surprises, right? Share the bad news even faster than you share the good news. Be proactive. Don't wait for the board meeting to go, by the way, we got 30 days of cash left. Can you bridge us? Like, as long as there's no surprises and your communication is consistent, it will go a long way.
Cool. So the next kind of section that I want to get into is more focused from the company's perspective, right? So as investors here, what do you see as an emerging region in the country that's doing some really interesting things? And then we'll kind of take it from there.
Just region or verticals?
Both.
Both. Okay. So I'm at least, and probably like a lot of people are seeing, in terms of regions, cities are starting to differentiate a little bit more. Like Boston and sensors and robotics, might as well be the same exact word at this point. You just assume that's where you're going to go to see weird robots and new sensors. Washington, D.C.'s got some great education tech going on right now. Silicon Valley's got everything. New York's fascinating because a lot of the cool smart city problems are easier to pilot in New York because you've got this massive population density. So, like, if you're doing a restaurant startup, you could just launch over, like, 2 square miles, and you can figure it all out, right? And you'll get the traction to go big. And it's been really neat to see the city sort of figure themselves out. In terms of verticals, I'm going to go back to sensors. Pretty much everything related to the real world is getting really interesting right now. We do a lot of construction and real estate tech, which sounds pretty boring from the outside, but I'll remind you they're massive industries, and they can all be sensed for the first time. So we're seeing a lot of fascinating activity investment-wise come up in these verticals because there's just so much money there, and nobody's really cracked it before because, you can't have a lot of risk going to building a bridge, right? So you're very, very risk-averse. But at this point, the value propositions are just too strong to ignore. And it's just been cool to see all these things go from, paper or, computers in a basement in a building to suddenly all being on the cloud, all sensing and all talking to it together.
On the consumer standpoint, I think regionally, finding the regions that aren't super oversaturated like Silicon Valley, but do have enough, not even just tech talent, but have enough sort of willingness to risk to start companies and to get employees is a big thing. Areas that I think that Texas could still emerge as one of the biggest hubs for VC. There's no state income tax. There's so many billionaires, and they have a very kind of cowboy mentality. The hard part is you go talk to a 70 trillion-year-old oil billionaire who's literally never used a computer, and they don't really understand why they would put money into your app. But you have people like Ross Perot's like great-grandson or something who are starting little venture funds there and starting to do tech. So Texas, especially the Dallas area, but I know other parts of Texas as well. Nevada, there's tons of government research money, no state income tax. I think anywhere that doesn't have a state income tax is going to be really pro-business and relatively easy place to innovate in. those are places that I think spend more time. The Midwest is a hard nut to crack because people there, I'm from Michigan. I'm from a 300-person farming town, and my first 2 jobs were on a farm, so I can say with confidence that people there are a little bit afraid of technology. They use Facebook, that's about it. But that actually kind of piggybacks onto my sector point, which is I think for a long time, consumer investors were really scared when you built a platform, or when you built on top of a platform, right? So if you were one of those TweetDeck type companies, everybody was so afraid because if Twitter changes their API and screws you over, which they always do, you're going to be screwed. I think now there are enough massive social networks that there's some safety if you can build across all of them. So if you're building, this is happening right now in media companies, which is kind of the space that I'm in, where if you're doing the majority of your distribution across Snapchat, Vine, Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp, the odds, even though all those companies, as I say, are owned basically by like 3 companies, but that's another thing, the odds that you're going to get completely like, rolled if one of those companies changes their terms of use or API is much lower than it used to be. So I do think that if you're building like a massive consumer distribution strategy, there's something to be said right now for really looking at how do we distribute across social in a low-cost manner.
And I would also add, sometimes being from a small region can be better, and if you articulate to the VC, you can get me really excited. Like the other day, I got a great pitch from Baton Rouge, and the guy pitched me a little bit, but we ended up spending a lot of time talking about how great it can be when you're one of only a few startups in a city because you don't have some of the terrible tech talent issues that you can get in like the Valley in New York and DC. So basically, wherever you're from, embrace it, love it, and tell me why it's awesome that you're there, and it doesn't really matter where you're from.
Cool. Well, the one thing I want to get to before we wrap up here is I wanted to talk about the actual process of why are we going through this process of meeting investors and finding out if your company's a good fit. So really briefly, just kind of give some last minute advice to why should you raise money? I mean, is it should you be able to bootstrap through as long as you can? Should you really get that early capital in? And any advice to the crowd here today to take with them as they go?
Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier about about the venture capital market. Go raise money when it's clear that you know exactly what to do with it. Don't raise money to fund your experiment to figure out if this thing is worth doing. Do all the groundwork first. Bootstrap to the point where you've validated your thesis and you can't go any further and you have really encouraging data. Outside capital comes with it responsibility and risk. You're taking money either from other individuals or from people's pension. And so, you have to take that seriously. And so when you're going to raise capital, be sure that you have enough data. And, the ironic thing about the investment community is that as soon as you do have the data and it's pretty clear the company's ready for capital, the money's there. It's the companies that really haven't proven that they should take outside capital yet that beat their heads against the wall for a long time. So the longer you wait, the more data you have, the stronger your product market fit. Leading indicators are, the easier the fundraising process is, and quite frankly, the more confident you can be going into your raise.
Cool.
Yeah, I would say know exactly what you're going to use the money for, right? So anybody who's raised their hand at the beginning, if one of us walked up to you and just gave you $1 million in a briefcase, if it takes you more than like 2 hours to start deploying that capital, you probably aren't at the point where you need to raise money yet. And I don't mean like, you're not broke enough, but I mean like have very specific, not like I'm going to beef up the engineering team. Like, okay, but front end, back end, iOS, Android, like why? What does it get you to? Really know exactly what you'll use it for and think as far as, like manifest as far out as you can, like exactly how you're going to use those dollars, then get the money and use like half of them because everything is more expensive and slower than you think it'll be. Hiring people is expensive, firing people is so expensive. Everything's really expensive, and there's always things that you don't foresee. You think it's going to be easy to go to a meeting with a VC on Sand Hill Road. There's a 3x surge price, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm going to spend $500 this week going to VC meetings. This is perfect, right? Like there's always unexpected expenses, so really hoard cash, but don't get cash in order to hoard it, if that makes sense. And then the other thing I would say is pretend like you're going to raise money and all the firms' names are in Pig Latin, basically, right? Like you need to know about the reputation of the investors before you take their capital, but I can't tell you how many first-time founders especially I've met with who are like, I'm going to do Y Combinator, and if I don't get into Y Combinator, I'm not going to do an accelerator. And I'm like, you sound like someone who doesn't actually need money, because all money is green. So, and there's places like Techstars and 500 startups that are just as good, but they might not have quite as fancy of name recognition within your group of friends, right? So make sure that if you do need capital and you're ready and you've hit the metrics, you can go raise it. You're probably, unless Mark Andreessen's already sending you checks, he's probably not going to send you a check, right, and do your entire round. So be smart about going far and wide and talking to people in different areas and whose funds you've never heard of before, because a lot of times that's where the best investors are.
It's going to take longer than you think, and it's going to be a lot harder than you expect. And in some ways, I feel it's a little bit like people that run ultra marathons, you know, where like, I swear they just like the pain. It's long and it's horrible, but they sort of enjoy it. And I feel like you have to kind of get that same mentality about fundraising. Like, okay, this is something I'm doing that's really, really hard. I'm right now trying to convince somebody that I know how to spend like $10 million, right? And I've got like 15 employees. Why would I know how to do that? You don't. It's crazy. So you have to just kind of embrace the beast, I think, and just be ready for the fact that it's going to be hard, it's going to be tough, but hopefully you'll come out with it with the money to do what you want. Have a plan. It's absolutely going to change. You know, get everything organized before you go out, otherwise you will get exhausted. So the people that I see that have prepared all of their decks and their business model and all the things that investors ask ahead of time, they don't drown as much, because they can go, okay, great, here's my data room, here's my files. It was great to meet you, follow up with some information later. So they don't get into the whole, oh gosh, they just asked me for a cap table. How do I make a cap table, right? That's how you get yourself stressed out. And there's plenty of good books and resources online that can prepare you for the kinds of things that we're going to ask you for. And if you've already got that homework out of the way when you head out, you're going to have a much better time.
Cool. Well, let's thank all our panelists for joining us.